Hi, this is the Tempter podcast where we discuss embedded Linux, IoT development, and lots of other things. Your hosts today are Kim Raj and Cliff Brake. How are you today, Kim?
Hey Cliff, I'm doing really good. How about yourself?
Yeah, it's been a great week. So, yeah, we're looking forward to discussing documentation today. So, we're going to talk through various aspects of documentation. What is documentation? How we do documentation, some ideas. Why is it important? So, maybe we could just start off, Kim. What is documentation to you?
Documentation is actually very important piece of the puzzle when it comes to anything you do from software writing, hardware development, or any other processes. So to me, it is on one side the easiest way to pass on information to people who support you vis-a-vis your
Mhm.
customers. It's also a helpful tool or a way for you to remember things that you can offload so you
Mhm.
can remind yourself later. And it's also a tool which basically are a medium with which you can spread the knowledge and scale your projects. So I see it as very, very vital in
Mhm.
any projects.
Yeah, that's a lot of covered there. There's many benefits to documentation, and for kind of thinking about what you just said, one part of that may be collaboration. If you're working on a team, which most of us are these days, how does documentation and collaboration go together? Do you have any thoughts on that, or?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and I think documentation should be as important as your project plan is. So there should be
Mhm.
a documentation plan, and perhaps you should start documenting way before you start doing other activities.
Mhm.
Um, because see, you need to document your processes, even what your project will entail, because you want to have someone else come over and work with you. They need to know the processes. So you could have them documented, they can learn through the processes and be onboarded, and you can basically scale it into larger teams as to what our processes are, how to kind of modify them and enhance them. So definitely there is benefits in that area. The second benefits I see is when you have like teams that are spread across the globe. We don't share same time zone. I mean, it's convenient that you hop onto a meeting and then you can talk through it and go that way. But um, that's not always possible. And even if you think if you have many people involved, and even if you are in same time zone, it's 40, 50 people sitting in that same time learning through this would also pose different kind of problems. Whereas documentation could be then this, helpful glue where they can go learn about it on their own and scale that way. Um, so yeah, I see these kind of important benefits. I know that you do documentation for other reasons, and so what will be some of the benefits you see?
Yeah, there's lots of benefits to documentation, and just thinking about what you said, you have experience working on larger teams. Most of the teams I work on are probably a little bit smaller because I work with generally smaller customers. And anything you do, it helps to have some amount of process. If you do hardware design, it's useful to have documented how you're going to do your schematics, document how you're going to set up your libraries, standard naming conventions. These are very helpful because when multiple people are working on something, it kind of all looks the same and feels the same. So that's
Mhm.
one area where we use documentation for any of our development flows. We want them to be repeatable, and we want anybody to be able to set up a build or check out source code and be able to work with it. And so if we document, how to set up a build, how to application is structured, and some basic things like that, it can really help onboard people. And yeah, and it can even like you said, instead of calling meetings for everything, documentation can kind of take the place of some of that at times if our conversations move to be more centered around documentation rather than documentation centered around meetings, if you will. So
Hmm.
yeah, lots of things we can discuss there, but I see huge benefits all across the board. And
Absolutely.
so we've been talking mainly about benefits to people you're working with. Do you find benefits to yourself? I mean, do you do it just for others, or do you do it for yourself as well?
Yes. So documentation, yes. So I think I've been part of a lot of meetings or other areas, and your general perception is that you are documenting it for others. And the examples I gave earlier definitely falls into that category. Um, but I see that there are immense benefits for yourself when you are treating documentation as one of your priority, and it really is an asset for your effectiveness. No matter what your role is, whether you are a manager or you are a coder or hardware designer, you name it. Some of the things that we do a lot of context switching, multitasking kind of projects nowadays, and it so happens that we delve into one problem maybe for a week, and then we switch our context and probably return to the same project maybe 2 weeks later, or frequency could be plus minus whatever it is. Sometimes we switch many times a day, but overall, when you are in the context and you spend time researching, figuring out something, say, if you're a coder, right, and you read through some data structure and you figured out how that data structure is laid out. Sure, it's part of your day-to-day job, but if you document it, you can come back to it when you return to it, and you can refresh yourself as to where you were at that point, and start from there, rather than most of the time you might forget. And yes, once you start sifting through the pages, you'll remember, but it's more organized and effective if you have one place to go. There is less distraction in your mind when you are switching that context, because the fact is that if you're switching context, you are distracted anyway. That goes without saying.
Sure.
So you want to minimize that. So definitely it helps in that regard. And second benefit I see is I write what I understand. And unless I understood it properly, I will not write it properly. So writing gives an exercise to your brain where you're grasping, you're learning the concepts, and it kind of makes it more clearer. So it helps you to learn things, to get that clarity in your thoughts when you write it down. So I might read about an algorithm and I might say, hey, I really understood it. But then, say if I go and write code for it, right, that is also writing. We'll come back to later. That's the interesting kind of writing. But let's say we wrote down that algorithm maybe in a flowchart or something. That will give us that clarity of, okay, this is what I read, this is what I understood. And often you'll find yourself referencing back to the document you're reading when you're designing that flowchart. Because the reason is you read through it, but probably you didn't fully grasp it. So that tells me that writing is giving me that opportunity to learn and clarify, which otherwise I wouldn't have.
Hmm.
So besides this, I think there are a few other things I know that we can talk about. But what I see is that as much as it is beneficial for others, it is equally beneficial to yourself, if not more.
Yeah, I would say if not, if more so even, and that's a real powerful thought because if we realize that documentation benefits us even more than it benefits others, then it's a powerful motivation to do it. And I really appreciate some of the thoughts that Leslie Lamport has shared. And if
Mhm.
you've never watched any of his material, his lectures or his videos, I highly recommend them, even if you just do a few of them. But one of his quotes is, this may be paraphrased slightly, but he says, if you're not writing, you're not thinking. You only think you're thinking. And what
Well
what write
said.
what writing does is it really helps the thinking process. And if you are able to get a thought out on paper, and after you write something out, however you do that, and you look at it and it looks horrible, that probably means your thinking is horrible. Your thinking is sloppy.
Hmm.
So you keep iterating on this
Hmm.
document until it looks right and it's clear and concise. And then that means your thinking is now clear and concise. So it's a good check. If you're writing, it's a good check just to make sure your thinking is good.
Rightly said. Rightly said. Yes, I totally agree with that. So yeah, I think moving to an interesting part of this is that you and I we do coding quite a bit, and so what is the difference, say, between a code or semantics and documentation, quote unquote?
That reminds me. Recently, we were discussing how we're going to set up some hardware design projects, and I had a docs directory in the directory structure, and one of my work associates says, "Why is there a docs directory? Everything's documentation. There shouldn't be a docs directory." And it kind of took me back a little bit, and I was thinking, well, he might be right. And really, I was perhaps using the docs directory as maybe some common documentation for all the projects, but maybe I should have named it common then or something. But really, if we think about it, coded schematics are documentation. And it's important to realize that when we write code or we write schematics or draw schematics or whatever we're doing, whatever design we're doing, we're actually writing this for other people. We may think, well, if the compiler's happy with it, then we're done. But really, we need to write it for other people so that it's readable, easy to understand, because that's really what matters. If compiler can understand it, that's good, but that's not really where we need to be.
Yeah, I think I've heard many times at work and other places, when somebody asks a question about the code, and somebody will say, or where is this code documented, or do you have um, any documentation? And then you'll hear this common phrase that didn't you read the code? So in a way, indirectly, they are saying code is documentation, right? So it's a way, as you rightly said, that it's not only you're interacting with the computer, because in the end, computer just understands ones and zeros. So if you had to like really write it for the computer, you would probably write it in ones and zeros and you're done. But the way you are abstracting it using programming languages or documentation languages or other higher order abstracts is because you want to make it readable by humans. So therefore, it's very important that when we should treat code as document rather than anything else, which is not only meant for the computers but also meant for other programmers and people who will be dealing with that code. And I also go a step further where I say that it's not only the other programmers or software engineers that would read that, but perhaps there would be other folks like maybe testers or QA or other functions, people who are experts in those areas, who would want who should be able to read that code and do their functions if they need to. So I think it's very important at that point. What I see is that you treat code like a document, as if you were to write a book or a essay or something like that. And so, of course, there is also part of it which then comes immediately at you is that if you want to do a good job of documenting, then what sort of tools should be used? So, do you have any recommendations for documenting tools?
Yeah, just getting back to what you said about code, it's important to treat it like documentation. One thing I've learned from the Go community is the importance of idioms, and that's having standard ways to write code that's simple, easy to understand, and that's really a strong value in the Go community. And the other thing that it's really benefited me is automatic code formatters and linters integrated into my editor.
Hmm.
Back 5, 10 years ago when I was doing mostly C, C++, that really wasn't a thing back then. None of the code editors really had that. But with Go, the Go tool became very popular, and then Prettier came out for JavaScript, and then since then it just seems like there's been an explosion of code formatting tools that integrate nicely with editors,
Hmm.
and that's really nice because it reduces. It's just one less thing you have to worry about. You just write your code, and the editor's always formatting it for you very nicely, so it's easy to read.
Hmm.
And then there's also linters that, like with Go, if you have an exported function, the Go linter will flag it if you don't have a comment above it, which would then become documentation in the Go doc.
I see.
So having linters that kind of encourage you to do documentation, I find that very helpful as well.
Hmm. Absolutely. I think that's a very critical point, and I think that many times, you review code and, you'll see like somebody saying, oh, you didn't tab it properly, or you didn't name the variable properly. And many times I've seen engineers say, why don't you look at the logic of the algorithm? It's solving a NP hard problem, and you are talking about,
Hmm.
variable names. But it's very important to have uniformity, especially when you're reading the code or when you're reviewing the code. Because see, when you're reviewing the code, you want everything to be away from your focus, should be on, say, logic or something like that. But in order for you to reach that focus, you have to make sure that all those distractions are gone. So you
Hmm.
don't want your brain to concentrate on, oh, why is this camel case or not? So because your brain will wander towards that, and then suddenly you've lost focus of giving a good review because you were not focused at that time. So I think that having that uniformity is very helpful for people who are reading through that code, be it yourself who wrote it or even others. And then when you are multiple people modifying that code, then it becomes even more important, because if you don't agree upon how the variable should be named, or what kind of tabs versus spaces or whatever you want to use, then the code will be kind of having all these mix and matches, which means that when later on you do changes to that code, reviewing that code will be very harder, because it will look very unorganized code, and therefore the reviewers will find it distracting. and
Exactly. Yeah.
uh, and so linters definitely helps with that. And even for C, C++ nowadays, it reminded me of Clang, which has formatter tools and linters that are available nowadays. So there's tooling all around, the different language runtimes that are now coming along. And there are editors which are now integrating language servers.
Hmm.
So they are providing you uniform code highlighting and other facilities that you can basically get as well. So definitely this really strengthens, gives you those tools that otherwise you don't consider as documentation tools, right?
Yeah.
Usually when people talked about documentation in the past, you had a documentation department. They were experts in FrameMaker or that kind of tools. But I think it's become that way, that more and more people have started to bring documentation closer to code, and that's a nice thing. Secondly, the tooling also has become more friendlier in that area, where you can basically add that documentation within your projects easily, and maintain them easily as well. So yeah, I think that has been a change in progression in past 10, 20 years that I've seen. um, and what is your thought on the tooling part there?
Yeah, we've been talking most or the last few minutes about documentation. Code is documentation, but I think there's also a place for standalone documentation in a project as well.
Mhm.
And I have some thoughts on that. I've come to believe that documentation should live close to the code. The open source repos on GitHub have kind of established a standard as Markdown
Mhm.
being used for documentation. And every repository has a README at the top level, and I think that's a good practice. Even for in-house code, you should have a README, a Markdown README at the top level that clearly explains, what this code does and just the basics. And then beyond that, I find it useful to have additional Markdown documents, alongside the code as needed, because there's some things that require more of a prose format than just like a comment on a function. When you're explaining an algorithm or kind of architectural details, how the big picture, I think there's a time to be writing out paragraphs. And additionally, sometimes diagrams are useful. And I've been using draw.io. It's a nice little app. You can run it in the browser online, or you can download a desktop version. So I use the desktop version because it's a little better at saving files than the online version. Those are the two tools I've been using a lot lately. And we
Mhm.
can, we can get into the trade-offs between those tools and other tools. I know Microsoft Word is probably what most people think of when they think of documentation. But anyway, what do you find useful as tools?
Yeah, I think good suggestions there, and I agree. I think having tools close to your project is very important. So having that single source of truth is very important. And be it an algorithm design or be it any other kind of user visible feature that you want to talk about, having that close to your code which is implementing that feature is definitely very helpful, even for onboarding new coders. They will understand how it is being used, even though it is not documenting the particular feature technically. And so I find Markdown, for example, is one of the good tools, easy to use, and I use it quite often, so much so that even my rough notes are written in Markdown nowadays. And it's so easy to document and lists and all. So it's kind of gives you that outline easily that you need. Um, and I also find it important that in many cases, when you document, say source code, sometimes it's not possible for you to write very elaborate code, or maybe the algorithm is a little bit complex. So basically using something like Doxygen or that sort of tools, to extract documentation out of the code itself is very helpful too. So I think that having that practice of seeing, can we extract this documentation into more presentable ways, would be very helpful too as well. So um, I think generating it from one source and converting into another source is, translator tools in between, they are fine. You can have PDF generators, doc generators and all those. But keenly, what I think is important piece is that the code itself should live next to the sorry, documentation should live next to the code. And the tools then becomes more or less convenience at that point, that how you want to disseminate that information down. So that would be like my go-to. And I'm basically okay if you were to write it in text, but then have some ways to make it available in a richer set if somebody needed to.
Yeah, and along with all that, if you have, like a lot of projects have a docs site, like open source projects will have
Mm,
docs.project.org. And and if you have linting and formatting, having all those integrated into a continuous integration system is also very important. It's kind of like unit tests. If you don't continuously run it and check it, eventually it can become out of date, and then so far out of date that it's not worth
mm,
fixing then. So continuous integration is very important.
Yeah, yeah,
And
totally.
with Markdown, one of the big benefits is you can edit it right in your editor right when you're writing code. It can just be in the same editor. For larger Markdown documents, I've been using Typora, which is a WYSIWYG editor. It almost feels like a word processor. You can do nice tables. If you insert graphics, they show up in lines. So it for larger documents, I find I tend to be using Typora more and more.
Hmm.
So I believe it's still free. You can download it for your desktop and run it,
I see.
but
Good recommendation.
it's well worth looking at.
Hmm. So, what do you find? Some of the positives of using Markdown compared to some of the other ways of documenting.
I think it really comes down to what are you optimizing for? Because Markdown is not the most powerful documentation format. If you go
Hmm.
into Microsoft Word, there's tons more you can do in Word. You can make it much prettier. You can do all kinds of fancy stuff in Word that you can't do in Markdown.
Hmm.
But the downsides of Word and other formats are the file formats are very complex. So if you check a Word document into Git and then someone wants to review a change, you can't because you can't diff a Word document. It's a big binary blob.
Hmm.
But with Markdown, if someone makes a change, they can open a pull request. Somebody reviewing that change can see clearly what changed in the document. There can be some discussions
Hmm.
around those changes, and you can iterate a few times. And so I
Hmm.
think the simplicity enables collaboration. So if you want to
Yeah.
optimize for collaboration, a simpler format like Markdown is hugely beneficial.
Yeah, that's a very good takeaway there. A good thought, actually. Yeah. And I strongly believe that optimizing for collaboration is the way to go if you have a scalable project
Mhm.
or you're looking for scaling a project. So I think we talked about documentation, and so what do you think? What's the where should it live? In terms of um, the documentation, how should it be stored, or should it live to next to code or something like that?
Yeah, so the biggest problem I see with documentation is it gets out of date, right? So
Hmm.
someone writes a product spec, someone writes an architectural document, whatever, and then we go off, run off and do the design, and the documentation is on a file server or it's in Google Docs or it's been emailed around, and pretty soon it's stale and out of date, and then it's just a relic of the past. It's of marginal use because it doesn't really keep up. So as we've been discussing, if we keep our documentation with the code,
Hmm.
it has a better chance of not becoming stale and out of date. But one step further, if we use our documentation as a platform for thinking about our design, then that ensures it stays relevant. And the way I like to think about this, if we want to discuss a design feature, we should document that and open up a pull request in our Git system. And then the discussion happens around the documentation.
Hmm.
So the documentation is leading the discussion and the collaboration. The way it works mostly is we get together in a meeting and someone is assigned as the scribe to take notes on the meeting, and then they publish minutes or whatever. And the documentation is kind of an afterthought about what gets discussed in the meeting. But if we turn that around and we put our ideas in documentation first and open a pull request, a discussion happens around the documentation, then I think that's a more powerful flow.
I see. Yeah, I think I absolutely agree there. And also, like, exchanging documentation, like um, your ways of like exchanging them via emails or other ways is inefficient in itself, because you'll be emailing multiple copies, getting comments, merging them, and then you'll have to have a difficult way where either you have to assign someone as your primary owner or document master, and then others are providing the comments, but then it's very, um, it's a process where you'll have to keep distributing the document rather than having a location where people can collaborate on it. And I think engineering focused documentation, people understand the git pull request workflow, and adding it as just another um, document or something, and having your documents part of your normal workflow helps a lot, because it's same workflow that you follow for the code or the documentation. You can extract a lot of this out of your teams, because it is not seen as an added work. So to that now I wrote the code, now I need to write documentation somewhere else.
Right.
So there is what you call friction,
Mhm.
even though we also have to understand that teams are under time pressure many times, and code is what they get to deliver, so that gets priority, of course. And once like code is working, everything else can be on the back burner, and documentation is one of the first one that goes on the back burner. So reducing that friction by tools and workflows is very, very important as well. So if you are setting up a project, think from this aspect that documentation is your primary channel, would take you far away in the project.
Yeah, and it turns documentation from being a burden to being something that actually helps you think
Hmm.
better about a project as a group.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just a refreshing way to work.
Hmm.
And I would challenge people, if you're emailing around stuff, documents and things like that, you're probably, there's better ways to do things.
Hmm.
Cal Newport has released a new book about
Hmm.
Imagine a World Without Email or something like that. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. But he's really challenging this whole idea that most of us should just be emailing everybody all the time, especially within a team or within a company. Email is not the best way to communicate.
Hmm.
There's much better ways to do it, and we've been discussing that. So if you're interested in this, GitLab has published in their company handbook a lot of information on how they do things, and you can get a lot of good ideas if you want a cutting edge workflow, that cuts
Hmm.
down on developer distraction and interruptions. And
Hmm.
they
Yeah.
they have a process where it's high friction to call a meeting, but it's easy to open a pull request, and that's exactly what you want.
Right. Right. And I think I've come to realize that with more experienced you are, more you should document, not other way
Hmm.
around,
Sure, that makes sense.
to be more effective. And many times, we kind of don't take think in that way, but it's very effective if you're working in a team and they're looking up to you as your lead designer. Um, Documenting your thoughts out helps the team way more than calling out a meeting for an hour.
Exactly. That's an excellent thought.
So, so another question that I'll ask you is, and I think you've dealt with this in the past, is you told me about that there was this documentation story about one of the schematics, um, where how it was documenting the nodes. So could you relate to that story to for our audience that you
Oh,
recently experienced?
yeah. So we were working on a project, and one of the engineers was entering symbols for the various components we're using in a printed circuit board design.
Hmm.
And I was reviewing the schematic, and there was a note below the symbol that said, pin 6 or whatever needs to be connected to ground per the data sheet. And it was a no connect pin, so it wasn't obvious from the symbol in the pin name that this should be connected to ground.
Hmm.
And I commented during the review. I said, "That's a nice idea, putting that comment below that symbol in the schematic." And he said, "No, I actually put that in the symbol library. So whenever anybody pulls that symbol into a new schematic, that note is already with the symbol. So he's captured that knowledge in the symbol that will be used on multiple designs. So anyway, that's the first time I saw that done. I thought it was a nice touch.
Right, right. So, yeah, I really like that because you can be innovative and effective by doing this. And I thought that it was interesting a story to share. Um, so I think the next question, probably the last question for today, is what are tools you use to manage documentation?
So one thing that's kind of nice is if you collect documentation in a nicely presentable format. And let's just talk about open source projects for a minute. If you go to most open source projects, they have the source code, and then they have a separate repository for documentation. And then typically that repository gets run through a static site generator like Hugo Doxy, which is maintained by Google, or Docusaurus, which is maintained by Facebook, and there's half a dozen other ones out there to generate a nice HTML site with all your documentation. But that kind of violates the principle we've been talking about, that documentation should be with the code. So I've been working on a process lately where you can take a source code project, it takes the docs directory, and then it runs through one of these static site generators. And I've actually been using Zola recently. It's written in Rust. It's a simple site generator. It's similar to Hugo, but much simpler
Hmm.
and a little more opinionated. So I think it's an excellent solution. But in one of my projects, I pulled documentation from like a firmware repo, a application repo, and a hardware repo. Each one of those has a docs directory. And then these get pulled into another repo. All these docs directories get put into one documentation site. And
Hmm.
I'll link to that in the show notes as well. It's the docs.simpleiot.org site. And I think that's a nice way to make nice user-facing documentation, but yet the documentation is also with the source code, very readable in a text editor, and can be edited by the developers as they work. And then
Hmm.
occasionally we'll just pull that all in and refresh the documentation site.
Hmm.
So
Nice. So, do you think that some of this which would make into our temp their handbook?
yeah, that's a good question. So some of these ideas I should back up a minute, we've been kind of collecting in what we call the Tempter handbook. It's we'll add a link, but it's in GitLab, and it's currently just Markdown files, and I occasionally generate a PDF. But we should also run it through the same process that we recently figured out and put that on a website as well. That's a great idea.
All right. So, any last thoughts, Cliff, on this?
Yeah, I'm sure I have lots of thoughts on documentation. I should probably just be quiet and stop. But one other tool that's kind of neat is Jupyter Notebook,
Hmm.
and it's a way to mix code, Python code, and Markdown in one document, along with showing the results. So any type of project where you're doing a lot of calculations or maybe some numerical analysis, that's an excellent tool. And it also outputs a nicely formatted output that can be easily read. So if you update a Jupyter Notebook to GitHub or GitLab or even Getia, all those tools know how to process a Jupyter Notebook, and it'll actually display in GitHub as the process notebook,
Mm,
with the output, whether it be graphs or numbers or whatever. So again, there's a lot of neat things, but
cool. Yeah. So I think
um,
it's more important that we treat documents as code and code as document,
excellent. Yeah.
and um, and obviously with that parting thought, thanks everyone, and I hope you find this episode useful. Please give us feedback on your favorite podcasting app, and thanks everyone, and thanks Cliff.
Yeah. Enjoyed it. Take care.